Well, I know that a number of folks in the audience we get the privilege of working with, so this may not be brand new to some of you, but hopefully it'll be of value to most or all of you. Um, there's a lot to think about with as it relates to GIS for Next Gen 911, and it's kind of a cloudy topic, I think, because it relates to technologies that aren't GIS technologies, that are more networking and communications technologies. And what I want to do today is kind of talk about a little bit of the basics of those technologies at a very high level, and then how it relates to GIS data sets as it moves forward with a next gen 911 system. Um, basically, GIS today in a 911 call center, or uh, in the constellation of technologies that support the the calling of 911 and the transferring and the routing resources. There's basically at the dispatch system that has a map, right? What they call a mapping system, which is the 911 system that has a map that kind of tells uh, where a caller's device is, where the interpolated location of a caller's device is, or if it's more of a traditional wireline product, it's the actual location of the phone that doesn't move. And then also there's a number of systems in first responder vehicles that will use GIS data as well. This would include things like automatic vehicle location systems. We'll add to that in next generation 911 a geospatial call routing system. And then if you utilize a reverse notification system or an emergency notification system of any sort, it may use GIS data to do its job as well. We look at GIS data and 911, we see kind of, if you think about this gap here that I've represented with this arrow, before, I guess, enhanced 911, which is kind of the label of the current system, came into being apparently in 1981, but really enforced with GIS data in the 1990s, as it prepared late 1990s and early 2000s, as it prepared for wireless coordinates to be located for what they call phase one and phase two. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then starting up in the late 2000s, right, 2010s are get started, next generation 911 as a concept comes up and begins to be kind of crafted as technology. And even its initial iteration of the redesign of 911, which is what you can think of next generation 911 as. It embraced fully GIS and GIS data as a core technology and data source for 911. In 2015, there was kind of the first deployments or implementations of NG-911 technologies. Up until now, in 2020, the federal government reported there were 10 statewide deployments. I think we all in the industry know that none of them are full on what are called I3 deployment, in-state I3 deployment. I3 refers to the version of the architecture, iteration 3. None of those are really true I3 in states yet, but they're all in transition. And since that time, I guess it's 2023 now, so in the last 3 years, there have actually been a lot more the statewide deployments that have begun the transition to include Wisconsin. Some Wisconsin counties are up on an EZNet now. I don't think any of them are truly geospatial call routing yet, for at least for all call or device types, but you're making good progress there. And so it's been a topic of discussion at the WLIA, at the state Department of Military Affairs, who runs the 911 system for the state, and at local levels, which you guys have been a part of for probably the last 5 years or better, I would guess. And most of you probably have been working on it if you have any responsibility in that system over that time period. You can think of 911 as a gold line. You can think of two sort of different phases of use of GIS data to support 911 and first response. Typically, like we've said before, that in the current PSAP environment, when I say PSAP, I mean public safety entry point. That's where the 911 call is delivered to and the response is routed out of. GIS technology has primarily been on this, we'll think of as the right side of the gold line, where the 911 call is delivered as an assistance data set that assists in the actual creation, or I'm sorry, response, the routing of the response and responders, right? That we make sure that the right police officer gets to the right place, the right fire truck gets to the right place, but not necessarily that the call gets to the right people. The NG-911 effort, the next gen 911, redesigns this to where it takes what used to be a real reliable location database because phones never moved right into a copper wire and they were literally tied to a wall and didn't move. As that technology changed and shifted, it took 911 a long time to kind of adjust to that. And so if we think about the delivery of the call, the 911 call for service on the left side of this gold line, that's a distinction in the industry. Are you routing calls or are you routing responses? And that's an important concept to understand as we go into how this relates to GIS. We should be using the same GIS data on either side of that gold line. I think up until recently, most cases, they were very different sets of GIS data that might have been routing 911 calls versus what was routing the public safety response, because the local agency had responsibility for the local response, but there was usually an agency or provider at a higher level, like a state or a county, that actually routed the phone calls to 911. So if we take a look at and think about this again as a foundation of understanding for what has to do with it, we kind of have to know a little bit about how 911 calls were routed back in the beginning. Back in 1968, the first 911 call was routed down in Alabama. The technology that routed those calls was largely untouched and remained the same for 30 years or so. And in the late 1990s, began to consider, how do we deal with these mobile phones? But in the basics of routing, and this is a very high level graphic, but in the basics of the routing, as somebody called 911 on a copper wire phone, the phone that hung on your wall, or later, initial early days of mobile routing, it would dial 911, and the voice and the telephone number would go to the telephone company's central office, where they had equipment called the selective router that would look at that and go, oh, they called 911. I need to send this telephone number's call to 911 to this public safety answering point. And it did that based on the phone number, right? Phone number had location information tied to it, which was stored in this ALI database, or this automatic location information database, which was really a subscriber's location database. This subscriber is at this location, and when 911 gets called, it should route to this PSAP. What an ALI database entails, and then bounce that up against or validate off of what's called a Master Street Address Guide, or an MSAG, which was a list of road names with address ranges and what PSAP should be getting a call on an address that falls within that road range, with that address range with that road name. And so these two databases were tabular databases, but they were in the guts of the selective router that actually routed the call to the PSAP. Once that voice and telephone number got to the PSAP equipment, it would send the voice signal to the operator, and then it would run a quick query on these databases and say, hey, I got this phone number, send me back the location data, right? Send me back the house number, street name, etc. that goes with that, and it would show up on a screen for the PSAP call taker to help process the call. Here's some examples of what an ALI database might contain and an MSAG might contain. As I mentioned, the ALI database has a primary key of the actual 10-digit phone number itself and contains location about the subscriber of that phone number. It would have a subscriber name, a house number, house suffix, street name, post directional, community name, state, and what was called an ESN or emergency service number that tied what PSAP is called. That would have to be before, so that when the call was initiated and running to 911, it would actually use this ALI database to show that information on the screen to a call taker. But before this database could be populated with a given record, it had to be double checked or validated against the MSAC, Master Street Address Guide. So if I tried to insert 1602 Taylor Page Avenue, Clarinda, California, it would come in and it would say, is there a range that supports 1602 East Taylor Page Avenue, Clarinda, California? And it would find that and say, yes, this is valid, and it would go ahead and insert that record into the ALI so that when the 911 call was placed, the information had been vetted, it was valid, and what would show up would be helpful for the most part. How does that relate to GIS data? We'll come in just a second, but NG-911, you can think of, as I mentioned earlier, as a complete redesign of the 911 system. That call flow that I just kind of talked about really goes out the window in a in-state NG-911 system and gets kludged into a transitional NG-911 system. But I want to explore with you quickly why does it matter? What does that redesign accomplish for us? It is the integration of all the other technologies that have come along that are communication technologies, things like things like text and video, what's called real-time text, so that as you're typing a text message, a 911 call taker see your typing in progress, your the great meme that's on Instagram out there where you type a whole message about to responding to your wife, in my case, where you're saying, no, I don't want to do that thing you're asking me to do. But then whenever it hits send, it just says, yes, that sounds great. That real-time text is kind of akin to that idea, is that it can see you typing things. And that's helpful because you can actually see maybe where somebody began to say something that they wanted to say but didn't want. And that becomes useful. So it's a different type of technology and a different type of tech. But the sending of things like pictures and videos, IoT technologies are huge and all have potential uses for contacting 911. I've been amazed at the type of IoT devices that are trying to get a nexus into 911. Things like I read one article about a research R&D project at AT&T that was going on, where they were working with a medical device company that had developed a insert for your shoe that would somehow detect if you were diabetic and about to have a diabetic episode. It would be able to sort of detect that without, it was, I guess, a wearable because it's part of a shoe, but it was without having to be too intrusive. And they wanted to integrate that to a communications network so that if it needed to, if the data in the device all pointed to the fact that they may have a medical issue and need EMT response, that it could call 911 for you. So that currently that's just not possible, but in the future, and well, I mean, currently in an in-state implementation is possible, but currently in most implementations of next-gen 911 technology, that's not possible. But the vision of the in-state is to integrate all those that are appropriate. Here you've seen refrigerators, things like that can access the internet. When we change over to an IP-based network off of that copper line phone network, the ability for your refrigerator to call 911 opens up. The possibility of that happening opens up. So in order to accommodate that, make sure that we're doing it in a way that facilitates a public safety response, not hinders it, like sending too much information or too many calls for service when the one from the phone would have done, you didn't need the refrigerator to call for you. So there's a little bit of that going on as well. So what are the components of a next-gen 911 system? There's three that I'm going to highlight here. One is the EZNet, or the Emergency Services IP network. That's basically the network that's going to carry all this data that'll help decisions be made in route calls. They contain things called next-gen core services, actually utilize GIS data from a local authoritative databases, and support call routing. That's ultimately where this happens, where your GIS data will interface with 911 system and help them route calls to the right PSAP. And then the third element is the 911 call handling equipment, or the CHE. It has mapping solutions. It interacts with CAD dispatch systems and other systems as well, but it's the actual interface that a call taker would use to answer and deal with the resolution of a call for service 911. Again, this is a very high-level graphic, even though it's quite busy and there's a lot of elements to it. There's a lot more detail that could be added here, but would not be relevant to this discussion. But if you think of that, the kind of current day E911 call flow that we looked at, the same elements are really present here. They're just sometimes done by multiple different what are called functional elements. Some use GIS data, some don't. This graphic is really focusing on the elements that utilize GIS data or play a part in that call routing systems. There's a lot more elements to it that aren't. But if you think about a call for service originating across a number of different types of originating service provider networks, IP devices like that device that might go in your shoe or a refrigerator, wireless phones, things like that, and the more traditional landline phone, they can all access this network because it's IP based. When I say IP, I mean Internet Protocol based. Come through some security functions, and it would first come to this emergency service routing proxy. That's the first question is to ask is, where do I send this call? And it parts that question out this other element called, these are all next-gen core services, as I mentioned earlier. Emergency call routing function that says, where do I send that call? It actually does a point and polygon query, as illustrated here, with either a geodetic coordinate, which is more likely to come off of a mobile device, or a civic address, 1308 South Validation Avenue, Highlands. And it will find a point, it'll query the polygon that it's in and say, where do I call? Where do I send this call? This polygon will contain attribute data that we'll look at in just a minute. That'll tell the system what SIP address, or session initiation protocol address, to send the voice and the data for this particular call to. And it's going to find that polygon for PSAP A and say, here's PSAP A's what's called Universal Resource Indicator, URI, which is the SIP address, and it'll tell it send it here. It probably uses, it's very likely going to use a geocoder to do that. It's either going to do it against a road center line, or it's going to do it against an address point to find that point. So how does your local authoritative data get address points, road center lines, and boundaries get into this next-gen core service system? It happens right here. It's what's called the spatial interface, the SI. The spatial interface is just that. It's an interface that you would log into. You would upload a geodatabase to. That spatial interface would kind of do some basic validations against that and find what are called critical errors, communicate those back to you, any discrepancies communicated back to you as a local data provider, so that you can go address those critical errors. And then it turns around and says, okay, now that I have my data that I'm going to accept, that is the critical error free stuff, I'm going to pump it out to the location validation function. I'm going to pump it out to the emergency call routing function. There are some others that are not listed here, but MSAC conversion service, geocoder service, and what's called a mapping data service, which is a visual representation of that same data. This spatial interface is where the local authority sort of uploads it, kind of throws it over the wall, if you will. There's a little bit of communication back and forth about that data that occurs there, but ultimately its most important job is to ship that data, once it's vetted, to the right functional elements in that call routing flow. Now, what kind of GIS data does it require to do this? I've only got 6 minutes, so I'm going to keep hard through some of these things, but it needs address points, road center lines, public safety entering point boundaries, and service boundaries, things like police, fire, EMS, potentially other things like public works or dog care or other systems, other services that may be dispatched by the 911 center, as well as what's called the provisioning boundary, which basically tells who has the authority to update data where. There's a couple of standards that I'll plug and mention and suggest that if you're into the stuff that you take a look at and read, noting that a lot of these are not GIS documents. They're not written for GIS professionals, but they tell the story of how things will happen in the technology. NENA is the National Emergency Numbers Association, who creates the standards making body for this technology, produce these documents. And if you are a GIS practitioner, I would say that you really want to focus in on Civic Location Data Exchange format, STAL 004, and the GIS data model, STAL 006. There are some additional ones that you could read if you're interested here, listed here. NG-911 data management requirement, provisioning of maintenance of GIS data for ECRF LVFs. I'll put an asterisk next to this one. It is currently being rewritten into a very different document. So it's got good information, good recommendations on how to manage GIS data for provisioning and maintenance of it to these NGCS elements, but the content will be changing soon. And then the I3 standard for NG-911 is that broader architecture document that if you really want to understand how these functional elements work together, that I3 document, STAL 0010, will be of interest to you. But as I mentioned, if you're really in the weeds with GIS data, these top two documents, the CLDXF and the GIS data model, is where I would recommend you spend some time. There is some effort that needs to be undertaken on your GIS data to make sure that it meets requirements. The road center line needs to be edge mapped with your neighbors as much as possible to prevent any dissonance on the answer to the question of where do I send this call. Should be split at the PSAT boundary. One that gives people some heartburn. There shouldn't be any gaps between roads, overlap, road segments, overlap or duplication. Address points should not contain duplicates. It's kind of the biggest point about address points. Just shouldn't have any duplicates, because that ECRF should be able to query the data and only find one point, not more. And it could include things that we refer to as non-addressed dispatchable locations, things that are common places or premise names. If you have government locations or school names, things like that, they can be represented as non-addressed locations in the address point layer. There's several different ways you could place these points. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I'm running out of time. Subaddressing is a good thing to have in places where you are near a boundary and there may be some sort of confusing answers as to where a given address is. We recently did a webinar on the value of subaddresses and how you might go about it and some of the placement standards that exist out there. So I'll reference that and just say that if you're in this space and you're interested in this topic, just Google up Datamark webinars. We do a monthly webinar with lots of educational value, and one of our most recent ones was about this very topic. PSAT boundaries should not have gaps unless they're purposeful, should not have overlaps, and should have no duplication. And you should work together with your neighboring data authorities, data providers, to be sure that you don't have any confusion about where those boundaries are. Service boundaries as well show the sort of response zones, if you will, for law enforcement agencies, for fire agencies or EMS agencies. Again, shouldn't have gap overlaps or duplications in those data sets. Now I'm going to pause here because we're kind of out of time. I'm going to take a look at upcoming. Yeah. Oh, actually, we're almost there. Good. You should be concerned with completeness, accuracy, and precision of your GIS data and the ability to support routing for 911 calls, geographic representations in topology, and that your attribution is accurate given that topology. So I'm actually going to stop here and again, thanks for the opportunity to talk through these very high-level basic things in 30 minutes, but if there's any questions that I can answer, I'll be glad to do.
Any questions?
Hey, Jeff, this is Cyrus. Appreciate your presentation. You dove into some of the spatial upgrading, but I've got a question about the kind of earlier on big picture and expanding the source of information that feed into your system. And I'm wondering, you talk about a critical mission for society, but also as you expand the sources of influence, the potential for malicious actors to hamper this system. And I'm curious the extent to which you've had discussions on that trade-off between being the mission critical objectives versus potentially having avenues of implementation, like the guideline rules of thumb for deciding to those trade-offs.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question. Let me get back to this graphic that kind of shows the call flows. There's a whole world of resources and experts that can answer your question far better than I can. But there is absolutely potential for malicious actors to get in the front side of this, to get into the spatial interface and change data, right? Change the routing of things, mess with the signals as they come through the EZNet out to the PSAP or off of the originating network. This little symbol here, the BCF, the border control function, is the key to the security of it. And I don't understand everything about that, but they proceed with the zero trust policy. And it is an important and serious topic that there is a whole discipline for. So there's a lot of people thinking about that issue and implementing solutions to help prevent that problem. But I think what we all know, if we've been in the IT space, is that cybersecurity, if you want to work in cybersecurity, you're really just saying, I want to work in a job where I can get fired because I can't be right 100% of the time. So malicious actions will take place, but there are mitigation measures that are being devised and implemented, put in place so that those are minimized and mitigated to the best, to the extent possible.
Good, thanks for that.
And there's plenty of malicious activities in the existing 911 network as well, spams and denial of service attacks and things like that, even across wireline networks. So it's an issue that'll always be there. Great question, though.
I have a question. Thanks for your presentation. I noticed that on your geospatial routing slide, it showed the geolocation format was in decimal degrees and it had 7 digits after decimal point and precision. Is that standard format that's used?
Which slide was that again? Yeah, so I don't know which slide it was, but precision and accuracy is a really touchy subject in this community because it's not something that is really given good specification for. I mentioned earlier that this one document, I'll come back to the document list slide. This one. This provisioning and maintenance of GIS data for ECRF and LVF's document gives some discussion to accuracy and precision, but when in the rewriting of it, there's actually a subgroup assigned now to go through and do a better job of saying accuracy and precision are important to this GIS data, but your system provider, next-gen core service provider, is going to have to give you precision and accuracy requirements. So I wouldn't inculcate too much to that 7 decimals past the zero, zeros past the decimal, because there's not an actual standard for it. But what's most important is more of the consistency of the address point attributes with the address attributes of the road center line, so that the right address point's in front of the right center line. And at the level of precision, I would say of like a parcel, if that is placed, you're in good shape. But there is no standard definition for that.
Thank you.
All right, do we have any questions online?
And let me see. I think I have my contact information in here all the way at the end. Let me slide through here. If you have any questions about any of this stuff that I wasn't able to address, and I just couldn't possibly address it all. Let me get to this. There we go. Here's my contact information. If you have any questions about it. Greg Brooks, some of you guys know Greg from WLI activities. He works with me as well in the Wisconsin area. So feel free to contact me or Greg if you have any questions, or we can do anything to help you support.